The Age of Absolutism. During the second half of the 16th century, new changes in military organization, weapons, and tactics increased the amount of money that was needed for warfare. Inadequate funding for this, along with the cost of government, caused monarchs to need to think of new sources for revenue. If the monarch was able to achieve financial independence without any help, that monarch would be able to achieve absolute monarchy. This new ruling style meant that all of the sovereign power was in the hand of the monarch, and they were able to rule without consulting anyone. Two main countries that began to attempt to achieve this were England and France. In England's monarch's pursuit of adequate income, they had jeopardized the local political interests and economic well-being of their country's nobility. Ultimately, absolute monarchy failed in England. On the other hand, the French king, Louis XIV, was more successful. He was able to make French nobility dependent on his rule while not taking away all of their rights. He instead supported their local influence and their place in the social hierarchy, which was a main factor in his success in achieving absolute rule. Constitutional monarchy in England. Prior to England having a constitutional monarchy, British monarchs were executive monarchs. They had the right to make and pass legislation. However, they were still expected to take the will of the people into account before making laws. During the 17th century, however, rulers propagated the theory of the divine right of kings, saying that they were above the law as their rule was given to them from God. This theory and the decisions and actions of the monarchs combined to make an outcome of widespread unrest in England. James I began this period of unrest. James wanted to rule without constriction and without having to ask Parliament for resources, so he levied custom duties called impositions. His religious policy also brought opposition. He did not further the Reformation, instead he chose to enhance Anglicanism. He also made peace with Spain, England's longtime enemy, which was seen by the people as a pro-Catholic gesture. Next on the throne was Charles I, who was like his father in his ruling style. Through a policy of thorough made by his chief minister Thomas Wentworth, he was able to rule independently of Parliament. During this, he raised many new tariffs. When England entered a war with Scotland, however, Charles was forced to call in Parliament, which eventually made civil war erupt. After the Civil War, the monarchy was restored by Charles II and then James II, which led to the Glorious Revolution. During this bloodless revolution, the Bill of Rights was created, which limited the power of the monarchy and gave some of the British people civil liberties. This established the constitutional monarchy in England. Rise of absolute monarchy in France. Henry IV came to the throne after the French Wars of Religion and sought to lessen the power of the French nobility. During this time, the economy was one that was able to be regulated by the government. Henry and his financial minister, the Duke of Sully, were able to create monopolies on gunpowder, salt, and mines, which prepared the economy for the later King Louis XIV and his financial advisor, Colbert's mercantilist policies. Louis XIII, Henry's son, was only 9 years old when his father was killed, which meant that Marie de Medicis would act as Louis's regent. She sought protection with the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1611 with France's enemy Spain. This alliance also arranged the marriage of the Spanish Infanta to Louis XIII. Marie introduced Richelieu as Louis XIII's chief minister, which he served from 1624 to his death in 1642. He adopted an anti-Habsburg policy, and although he supported the Spanish alliance to the Queen and Catholic religious unity in France, he was determined to put a stop to the Spanish power and influence in Europe. He aided the Protestant Sweden during the 30 Years' War against the Habsburgs. He also was successful in gaining land and political influence for France in the Treaty of Westphalia and with the Treaty of Pyrenees, which sealed peace with Spain. He succeeded in strengthening the power of the monarchy by saying that there was one ruler and one law was above all, even nobles, who he treated harshly for disobedience. He also began a campaign against the Huguenots, which ultimately eliminated their political and military rights, making them reliable subjects. He also was a patron of the arts and the printing press. both of which he used to defend his actions and put reason of state into the French people's heads. He also contributed to the French debt greatly. Louis XIII died in 1643. When Louis XIV was 5 years old, and Louis's mother allowed Mazarin to control government due to her son's young age. He would attempt to carry out Richelieu's policy of centralization, but would also have to combat backlash from long-building resentment, the Fronde. Its goals were to reverse the drift to absolute monarchy and preserve the nobles' autonomy. This revolt was initiated by the Parliament of Paris in 1649, and the nobles also followed. This Fronde ultimately convinced the people of France that they would rather have one ruler than have many regional rulers competing for power. Upon the death of Mazarin, Louis assumed personal control of the government. He started off by not appointing a single chief minister, which made revolt more difficult. The people of France would be challenging the king directly if they did rebel. Louis also developed many steps to achieve a favorable absolute rule. He used propaganda and political image, and he also made sure nobles would benefit from his authority. He used his propaganda to build up his image and to have his people be in awe of him. He became known as the Sun King, as he was believed to be the light for the people. He was able to eliminate nobles as a threat by appointing them in local parliaments, giving them the illusion that they had power. He asserted his power through the divine right of kings. One king, one law, one faith. He also used the physical setting of his royal court at Versailles to exert his political power and control. Due to his personal rule, he was the controller of favors and patronage in France. If nobles asked for something, he granted it, if and only if they respected him and his power. Louis supported France's social structure and privileges of the nobility, which was a main factor in his success in controlling them. He also believed that political unity and stability required religious conformity, which was shown in his suppression of the Jansenists in 1660. This was a wrong move for the king, as Jansenism had been slightly Catholic religion that appealed to the Protestant Huguenots. He eliminated any hope for a peaceful religious unity in France. He also made another attempt at religious conformity in France by revoking the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This edict had been around since 1598, protecting the religious freedoms and civil rights of the French Protestants. By revoking this edict, Louis destroyed the world of the Huguenots. They were banned from government office and certain job professions. Protestants also had their schools and churches closed down, and many of the Protestants were continually bullied into converting to be Catholic. This revocation of the edict was a large downfall for Louis, one that he did not even realize. It turned a lot of the French people against him, and it increased tensions between Catholics and the Protestants. Louis had other downfalls in his absolute rule, such as with the many wars that he caused. His absolute power in France caused him to have an increased sense of pride and also a large ego. His confidence was built up as he rose to controlling the people of France. Now, France was in a position where it could dominate any force, and Louis would exploit this fact. His main war began as the War of Devolution, and would later evolve to be the Spanish War of Succession. This was fought over Louis's claim to certain Spanish provinces through his wife, Marie-Therese. Early in the Treaty of Pyrenees, Marie had renounced her claim to the Spanish succession if Louis paid her dowry upon their marriage, which had not been done. Louis would send an army to the Spanish Netherlands. He was countered by the Triple Alliance of England, Sweden, and the United Provinces of Holland, who would be able to get him to make peace in a treaty where Louis gained a few towns bordering the Spanish Netherlands. He also went on to form an alliance with England afterwards so he could invade the Netherlands, which had minimal success. He only gained a small amount of territory from this. The War of Spanish Succession was also a point where Louis believed in his absolute power too much. The Habsburg ruler Charles II left the Spanish throne to Louis's grandson, Philip V. This caused Louis to become angry. God's hand was in Charles' will, which he could not allow. France was set up for failure, as they had insufficient funds, a poor army, and bad military leadership. This war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Philip V was the new king of Spain, but the French and Spanish thrones would be separated forever. Louis died 2 years after the end of this war and left France with a large sum of enemies. Absolutism elsewhere. The idea of absolute rule spread throughout Europe and could be seen in several places. In Russia, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, could be seen as an absolute ruler. He was the first ruler that could be considered a czar. Ivan also lessened the power of the nobility, or boyars, that were in Russia. He used secret police to hunt down his enemies, and he also gave Russia a code of laws. This time period that he ruled in was called the Time of Troubles. Peter the Great was the next example of an absolute ruler, but one that was just not just attempted. Peter had traveled throughout Europe, which gave him a new view of the world. He was determined to westernize Russia. He tamed the boyars, or noble class, in Russia by changing their rough appearances. He had then made a table of ranks that told everyone's value and privileges that each group had. He was successful in forming the first Russian navy. The main factor in his absolute rule was that he brought the Russian Orthodox Church under the control of the central government and abolished the position of the patriarch. He also constructed the city of St. Petersburg, which was like Versailles, and it served as a physical representation of his absolute power. Austria was another place where absolutism was attempted but not necessarily completed due to the composition of multiple national groups, which each had their own laws and political lives. Charles IV began the Pragmatic Sanction, which was led by Marie Theresa, his daughter. This was both a success and a failure due to the fact that Charles did secure a permanent line of succession, but did not protect his daughter from foreign aggression. In Prussia, Frederick William the Great Elector came to power after the 30 Years' War and built up the Prussian army. He was able to maintain the support of the nobles by allowing them to partake in government, have an unlimited power over their peasants, and also hold high military rankings. He also reinforced serfdom.